All right.
Okay, continuing on with our outstanding guest speaker series, today the TMCC Library Open Genealogy Lab is proud to welcome back Senior Professor of History, Robert S. Davis. Robert Davis has built a research collection at Wallace State Community College, Huntsville, Alabama, that pioneers promoting and teaching local and family history in a college environment. He holds a Master of Education degree in history from the University of North Georgia and a Master of Arts degree from the University of Alabama at Birmingham. Bob has more than 1,250 publications on records and research, as well as various appearances on television. His work has received numerous awards, and he has spoken to hundreds of groups across the country. Today's lecture is titled How to Use Federal Land Records of the Eastern United States in Your Family History Research. So without further ado, I would like to offer a warm virtual welcome to Robert Davis.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. A couple of points to make right off. If you have questions, and yes, you will have questions, this is a complicated subject, but yes, you'll have questions. Put your questions in the chat feature, and I promise you at the end of the class, we'll answer every one of them to the best of my ability, or maybe the ability of some other people here as well. Now, let me explain. My knowledge of federal lands is limited to the southern United States. I have never researched federal lands in California or Nebraska or Oregon or Minnesota. But let me say that of what you're going to hear today, I would think well over 90% of it would apply to any of the federal land states, any of the federal land states. All right, let's get on with it then. All right, now what I'm going to talk about may be a little simplistic for some of you, but the whole thing of it is land records and property records are not commonly known to many people, not to everybody at any rate. So I need to explain the basics of land records. Now, there's always a problem in explaining about federal land records or land grant records or property records, and that is the speaker gets so tangled up in explaining the technical aspects that he leaves everybody behind, and nobody's awake to hear the really good part, like how this helps me with my genealogy. So I'll try to keep this simple and concise and to the point. First off, understand land records are confusing, and the words like homestead and patent and township, they all have different meanings under different circumstances in different times and in different places. So don't be confused when in Georgia they're talking about a homestead record, and what that means simply is a tax exemption, whereas opposed to homestead with regard to federal land records, which means free federal land. But we'll talk more about that. Understand that a land grant is not a deed. A land grant is when a government, let's say the state of Tennessee, uh, or a national government, let's say the King of Spain, gives land that has never been recorded, never been in the tax system or whatever, gives land to someone. The original granting or giving of the land is what is called a land grant. In federal land records, a land grant is called a patent. It's called a patent to the land. And I'm sure there's a complicated explanation for that that we're not going to get into today. But understand that a land grant is when a state or national government gives land to an individual or a corporation for the first time. That is, the land has been given for the first time. All right, once land has been granted to someone or to an organization, the owner can then sell or transfer the property. That's what we call a deed. They can mortgage it. They can leave it in an estate. They can lose it to debts and taxes. And in fact, our entire legal system is built around property. Court records, estate records, marriage records, tax records, they all have to deal with property. And that property, most of the time, is land. You know, we talked today about whether you're for or against gay marriage or something like that, or whatever. But marriage before the law is about property, not about sex and not about uh, who can marry who or whatever. It's about the right of property, the right of property. And land in America, in early America at least, was a real basis of liberty. There was a time, yes, of course, men only could vote, but not every man could vote. He had to be a property owner to vote. And people who did not actually own property were considered as worthless in early American society. This is the reason that married women were not allowed to own property. This is the reason that slaves were not allowed to own property. And in fact, even free black people were not allowed to own property in some places. Land cannot be mortgaged, transferred, or taxed until it is granted. You can live on a piece of property your entire life, but if that land has never been granted, then that land is not yours. And while you don't have to pay taxes on it, you also cannot sell it to someone. It cannot be inherited by someone else. Land has to be granted first before it can be sold or mortgaged or deeded or whatever. And we've got a very good book here by E. Wade Hone. This is a classic book, Land and Property Research, which explains about deeds and mortgages and land grants in much more detail than we will go into today. Now, if you've got an issue about women ancestors who came to own land or did not own land, Mary Lynn Salmon's book, Women and the Law of Property in Early America, is just a fantastic book on understanding property laws in regards to women. All right. Now, federal land records can be a lot of work for little or no useful information. I know what it is to spend many hours tracking down a federal land record, and then all I've got to show for it is a really fancy piece of paper and nothing that helped me advance my research in the least. However, federal land records can also, on occasion, contain personal records of individuals that you will find nowhere else. We'll be talking about the military bounty land records in a few minutes. In those records is the only documentation that survives for thousands and thousands of marriages in early America. That can show you how valuable those can be. And there's all sorts of wonderful information that you might find, might is the operative word, you might find in the federal land records. I think myself that even if in federal land records it's only one record in five that really tells me something new, well, I'll take 1 in 5 any day of the week. All right, federal land records can indicate when someone settled in a particular section. However, don't be fooled by that. It's quite possible somebody lived on land for many years before they finally got around to getting a land grant or a patent on it. As they say, this could have gone on for many years. They could have lived in the area for a very long time before they finally went down to the land office and bought land, or they went to the courthouse and bought land from someone who already owned land. But our pioneer ancestors, as they say, they could have lived in an area for a very long time before they acquired the land by any means. Now, each piece of federal land has, each piece of federal land has a file on it, at the National Archives and Records Administration in College Park, Maryland. 4 out of every 5 of these files contains nothing you don't already know. It will tell you when your ancestor made the payments on the land, when your ancestor received the land, when the formal patent, that is the land grant, was issued. Nothing that really helps you in your research. But out of those 5, one of them, 1 out of every 5 of the federal land grant files that we're talking about involves some kind of a land dispute. Let's say grandpa made the first 3 payments on the land. Then grandpa died. And then let's say grandpa's children each want to claim the land, so each of them wants to make the 4th payment. but only one of them can make the fourth payment and the fifth payment, which would get them the land. And so they're having a knockdown, drag them out dispute over who has the right to the land that grandpa started making payments on. And this could get really ugly, and this could get really detailed, and you can get things like a list of names of all the descendants. You can get the whole family history. Well, we're actually the children by the first marriage. He was married to so and now it's his second wife who's claiming the land, but we should get it because we're the children of the first marriage. You can only imagine. And then there can be all kinds of arguments about, well, grandpa promised me the land, or grandpa uh, didn't promise my brother the land. Anyway, like I say, it's worthwhile always to contact the National Archives and Records Administration and obtain the file on the federal land that your ancestor owned. Now, military bounty land grant and homestead land grant files, they can be a rich source of personal information. So much so that we're going to talk about each of those separately in the next few minutes. All right. Now, land in the United States was granted by foreign countries like Spain and France and Great Britain. It was granted by individual states like Georgia and New York and Pennsylvania and North Carolina, and or it was granted by the federal government. Now, immediately the thought crosses your mind, how do I know which is which? Okay, I'm going to explain that right now. We have 50 states in this country. Each of those 50 states is either a federal land grant state or it is not a federal land grant state. There is no state that is one or the other. They're all each of our 50 states is either a federal land grant state or it's not a federal land grant state. If it is not a federal land grant state, then you have to contact the state archives, or in places like Texas, the state land office, to deal with the records of land granting in that state. And we're not going to go into that in any detail because of the states that are not federal land grant states. Every one of them did things completely different from all the others. I mean, I could spend the rest of the afternoon just talking about how land was granted in Georgia, which is not a federal land state. And someone else could talk to you about New York, which is also not a federal land state. Okay, now the states that are not federal land states and will not be discussed in this session are the original 13 colonies: Hawaii, Kentucky, Maine, Tennessee, Texas, Vermont, and West Virginia. And as you say, if you're dealing with land granting in any of those states, you have to go to their respective state archives or land office to search the records there. Okay, all the other states are federal land states, and their records are kept in one of two places, either in the Bureau of Land Management or in the National Archives of the United States in College Park, Maryland. And we'll talk more about that in the next few minutes. Now, if you want to go into more detail than we will go into in this session, see James C. Barcy, The Basic Researcher's Guide to Homestead and Other Federal Land Records. Okay, many federal land states have copies of their federal records at their respective state archive. And that's always a good thing to do, even if it's a federal land state like Oklahoma or Arkansas or Alabama. Check at the state archives and see what they have in regards to federal land grant records. Many states have specific resources just for their state that are special. For example, Alabama. Alabama has the county tract books for every county in Alabama online, free. And you can go there and hunt up your ancestors' land grant information. The same may not be true of Mississippi or Arkansas, but they may have their own special sources at their archives for their respective federal land records. And of course, it's always a good idea to check at the state archive in any state to see what they have. And for many of these states, anything special in regards to federal land records are described in Ancestry's Red Book, which is really good for each state in the Union. Now here's our map, and this clearly shows for us which states are federal land states and which ones are not. These brown ones, none of them are federal land states, so you have to go to their respective state archives. Texas is not a federal land state either. There's a long story behind that, and we're not going to share it today. Hawaii is a federal land state, but Alaska is, Hawaii is not a federal land state. Hawaii is not a federal land state, but Alaska is. But Alaska is. All right. Now, how did the federal land system begin? And why is it we even have a federal land system? Why didn't they just leave all this up to the territories and the states? Why did the federal government get involved? Well, I can tell you part of it right off the bat. When the United States began as a country, the only federal taxes were on imports and money. The money that ran the United States government came from selling federal lands to people in the West. And the government would have gone broke without the money from selling lands in the West and the money from import taxes. After the American Revolution, each of the new states, and that's what's shown on this map, each of the new states eventually gave to the United States all of the land in the West that they claimed. Now here you'll see, here's poor little Massachusetts, and Massachusetts is claiming Michigan and Wisconsin. Why Massachusetts claimed Michigan and Wisconsin, I have no idea, much less why Connecticut would. But be that as it may, that's the stories for another time. But each of the states gave up their western territories to the United States government. Also, the United States government acquired East and West Florida, Louisiana Purchase. We acquired land from the war with Mexico, etc. And so the United States government has all of this land, and it needs a means of transferring this land to the American people. Transfer the lands to the American people. All right. Now, when the United States took over somewhere like Florida, there was already land that had been granted to people living in Florida. So what the United States government simply did was, if you had a grant from the King of Spain or from the King of Great Britain or from the King of France or whatever, then the United States government recognized your claim, recognized your land grant. And that just simplified things very, very quickly. Now, by the way, there's a series of books, and we'll talk about them more in a moment, called the American State Papers. And in the American State Papers, for Florida, for Louisiana, for any of the lands in the East that the United States government took over that had already been granted by a previous government, all of that is covered in the American State Papers. So if your ancestors were early French in Louisiana or Arkansas, or they were early Spanish in Florida, or an early settler of Florida, information on their land grants will be in the American State Papers. Okay, now in the early years of America, there was a huge amount of speculation in Western lands. This is what destroyed the fortune of Thomas Jefferson, the fortune of Robert Morris, who had financed the American Revolution, of Light Horse Harry Lee, the father of Robert E. Lee. They all lost money speculating in Western lands. And Congress was so desperate to sell the land to the land speculators that Congress never fulfilled to the Continental soldiers Congress's promises of giving them land for their Revolutionary War service. If you lived long enough, Congress eventually paid you what it owed you for serving in the Continental Army, but most of the Continental soldiers never saw the land that they were promised. However, nine of the original 13 states did grant land to Revolutionary War veterans. But that's not federal land, that's state land. Now, much about the federal lands can be found in sources on the individual territories. Now, here's where I talk about the American State Papers. This is a huge set of books. Originally, the United States government did not intend to have an archives. They intended to simply publish all the important papers of the United States. And the original plan was to do this in the set of books called the American State Papers. This is a wonderful resource to search for your early ancestor in the early American territories. And it's online. You can do word searches of these old volumes, and the actual pages from the volumes turn up on the screen. You can find all sorts of wonderful things. A second set of published records is called the Territorial Papers of the United States. And these are online at Hathi Trust. Hathi Trust, by the way, is a wonderful resource for doing word searches and finding your ancestors and your family in books you've never heard of, but where they appear. Anyway, the Territorial Papers of the United States. Now, both of these publications are also in printed books at major libraries, and you can use the original book if you want to, instead of doing an electronic word search over the internet. But both of them are fabulous sources for information, and you never know what kind of great stuff you might turn up on your family in them. Now, some territories had special sources, such as the Mississippi and later Alabama Territory, in books that were done by Ben and Jean Strickland. They did a huge series of books on the Mississippi Territory and its records. A wonderful resource for Mississippi and also Alabama, because Alabama was created from the Mississippi Territory. So, as I say, in each of these states that had been territories, check at their respective state archives and learn what is available in the way of territorial records. All right, now we've been talking about the federal land system. Now let us seriously talk about the federal land system. Thomas Jefferson was our first Secretary of State, and he was probably the best Secretary of State we ever had. The man was an absolute genius. Always liked what John F. Kennedy said about Thomas Jefferson. Kennedy was addressing a luncheon at the White House for Nobel Prize winners, and he said, "This is the greatest collection of brain power ever assembled here, except when Thomas Jefferson ate here alone." But Thomas Jefferson came up with all sorts of things: our currency system, the street plan for Washington, D.C., and so much else. He also designed the federal land system. And the federal land system is just beautiful in its simplicity and in its genius. And this is part of the reason that talks like this one get so bogged down in detail, because often the narrator just enjoys talking about the system so much that we forget to explain why this should be important to you. All right, here's how Thomas Jefferson's federal land system worked. All right, in 1785, when he developed this system, the people of the United States knew practically nothing about the United States. Our maps were terrible, and it was even worse out in the West. So what Thomas Jefferson would do is he would designate a specific point, a point that could be found by using the stars, a point of longitude and latitude. And through that point, he would draw a north-south line. And the north-south line would be called a meridian. In Alabama, the most famous meridian that we have is the Huntsville Meridian. Our second most famous is the St. Stephen's Meridian in South Alabama. But first, the government picks a point, and from that point, the government draws a north-south line called a meridian. And then they draw through the middle of that line an east-west line, and that's called the baseline. So you've got the meridian that goes north-south, and you've got the baseline that goes east-west. Where the two intersect is called the 0 point. This is the 0 point. Now, every 6 miles on the baseline going east and west, there is a range line. There is a range line that goes north and south, just like the meridian does. It parallels the meridian. And this is every 6 miles along the baseline. And then from north going east to west, there's a series of lines that start at the north and go south, and these are called township lines. Each township line is 6 miles apart. 6 miles apart. Now, if I lose you at this, don't feel bad about it. It's really something you need to try out on a sheet of paper to see how clearly it works. Okay. And for, okay, now, moving right on. All right, this is Alabama. This is the Huntsville Meridian in Alabama, the Huntsville Meridian in Alabama, and its baseline, which runs right along here, right along here. All right, where the range line and the township line intersect forms a square that is 6 miles by 6 miles. This is called a township, and each of the townships is numbered based on where it is on the meridian. For example, you could have Township 1 South, Range 4 East on the Huntsville Meridian. And that is one unique square that is 6 miles by 6 miles. Each of these townships is then divided into 36 numbered squares. Each square is 1 mile by 1 mile, and each of these squares is therefore 640 acres. And each of these 36 squares that make up one township is called a section. And as I say, each section has a number. Okay, the section is 640 acres, but the section is divided up into still smaller parts. Each section is divided into 4 quarters, and this is called a quarter section. Each quarter section is 120 acres. Like they say, do the math. Okay. Each quarter section is divided into quarter section. Yes, I know that's not proper grammar, but each quarter section is divided into quarter sections. And each of those is 40 acres. And it's from this, by the way, we get the expression 40 acres and a mule, because it was said that any American family needed to prosper was 40 good acres of land and a mule to plow it with. And so that's where it comes from. A full citation to a piece of land might say Huntsville Meridian, Range 3 West, that's along the baseline. Township 4, that's along the township, the meridian. Section number 28 within that square. The northwest quarter of the southwest quarter. Now, this is what it actually looks like. This is your meridian here. This is your baseline. And then here's the grid that the two form. And as I say, each of these township squares has a number. And then this is what a section looks like. See? 1 mile by 1 mile, divided into 4 quarters, each of which is 120 acres. And then of the 4, of each quarter section, each is divided into a 40 acre quarter section. Now, you're saying, okay, you've thrown a lot of technical gobbledygook at me. Why is this important? It's important because when you're reading the deed to your ancestors' property, or you're reading the land grant called a patent on your ancestors' property, it will be described by the section number and then by where within the section the land is located. So that's why it's important. But like I say, once you practice with it a little bit, you can do it in your sleep. It's not nearly as complicated as it sounds like it is. Now, here's one of the real beauties of this system. We still use it today. Your ancestor received a patent for land in the state of Alabama from the federal government. And you give me the Meridian, you give me the township number that is the township line and the range line, and you give me the section number, I can take out a modern Alabama county road map and see exactly where that land is today. I can take out a United States government federal topographical map, a modern one, and I can locate exactly where your ancestor's land was. I don't care if Thomas Jefferson gave your ancestor the patent 220 years ago. We still use the same numbers on the same land on the same location. So what you can do is in Indiana or in Wisconsin, in California or Nebraska, in Alabama or in Arkansas or Louisiana, you can take the designation of your ancestor's patent or your ancestor's deeds, and you can go to a modern map of the area, and you can find the land right down to the foot. You can then drive to the land, or if you're in Louisiana, take a boat, but you can drive to the land and you can actually stand on the very property that your ancestor owned. Now, that's all warm and fuzzy and brings a tear to your eye, but more important than that, once you know exactly where the land was, you can look for graves. You can look for chimney stones. I have had someone track down the land that their ancestor lived on. It was federal land, and so follows Jefferson's system. I've known people who have gone to the land, knocked on the door of the people who live there now, and asked them how old their house was. And it turned out that it was their ancestor's house of more than 150 years ago. On the other hand, you may be like me, and when you track down the federal land that your ancestor lived on, you discover it's now a Walmart. Well, that happens. Okay, the deed records and the tax records in federal land states still use this federal land designation, just like they did 200 years ago. And now, each of these quarter sections, that is a quarter of a section, is supposed to be 40 acres. Often they are not. The reason is that the surveying back then was very difficult, and often surveyors made mistakes. And when the land was surveyed by our modern methods, it was discovered that the quarter section was not exactly 40 acres. It was 40.5 acres or 38.7 acres or something of that sort. So if the land today is not exactly 40 acres, don't worry about that. It almost never is. All right, now let's talk about the Bureau of Land Management. They do God's work. They are just wonderful people to work with and just a super organization. All right, the Bureau of Land Management manages the federal lands, which is an awful lot of the United States. They have tract books, which are lists of all the land grants by county in the United States on the federal lands. They have a complete set of the tract books. They also have plat maps where they've made notes over the years. You can contact the Bureau of Land Management and you can ask them to send you all the records on your ancestors' federal land. All the records on your ancestors' federal land. Now, when you go to the Bureau of Land Management's website, if your ancestor received a federal land grant, also called a patent, you can look it up on their website and you can print a copy of the actual document. That is, you can have a copy of the actual federal land grant record that was signed by President James Monroe, or signed by President Abraham Lincoln, or signed by whichever president approved your ancestors' land grant. And of course, what you can do then is stain it with some coffee, blow dry it, put it in a frame, and then lie to people about it being the original document. But anyway, what the Bureau of Land Management has been doing is they've been scanning all these land grants, also called patents, onto their website so that you can find the ones for your ancestors and, as I say, print them off for free on your printer. Now, they haven't gotten all of the patents in their system yet, but they are working on it. They do not have the credit land grants from 1796 to 1820, and they do not have all the military bounty lands from 1842 to 1858. They will eventually. They will eventually. Now, where do you go for more information on this? Where do you go to get all of these wonderful records? I thought you'd never ask. Go to the Bureau of Land Management's website, which is right here, and they take you through the whole process step by step. They explain in glorious detail what their records contain and how you can get copies of them as they relate to your ancestor. Okay, now how were the federal lands granted? How did your ancestor get his patent to federal lands? Okay, within each federal land state, there were land offices. And the land offices varied from time to time. Sometimes they had lots of land offices. Then over the years, the number of land offices shrank as most of the federal land was taken over. The last federal land office closed in 1927, and any remaining federal land that had not been granted was turned over to the Federal Land Bank, and those lands are today belong to the Bureau of Land Management. List of persons who received the land grants and patents are called tract books. Tract books are arranged by state, county, township line, range line, section number. The Bureau of Land Management has a complete set of these tract books, and it's a good thing to get a copy of what they have because, as I say, notes were made on the maps and were made on the tract books, in the tract books. Each state archives of each federal land state has a copy of the tract books for its respective state and often other resources. Often a county will have a copy of its county tract book. In Alabama, every Alabama county has a copy of its federal land tract book. The Alabama Secretary of State has Alabama's county tract books online, although there's something wrong with their tract books or with their index, because I can find Alabama land grants and then I go to this online index to Alabama tract books and the land doesn't show up. But that's okay. You can also go through the tract books page by page for a particular county, looking for the records of your ancestor getting land grants. And many of these county tract books have also been published, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. Now let's talk about how many different kinds of federal land grants there were. First off, federal lands were sold in installments from 1785 to 1796, and then they were sold from an installment plan from 1820 to 1927. Now, but the system basically worked this way. You had 5 years to pay for the land, and you paid for the land in 5 annual installments. And when the 5th installment was paid, then you got the patent or land grant for the land. Now, it doesn't matter who made the first 4 installments. It's whoever makes the last installment that actually gets the land grant, the land, the patent, the whole 9 yards. That's where you get these ugly disputes when somebody dies or somebody sells their right to the land. And then there's a big argument. There can be a big argument over who is going to be allowed to make the final payment and to get the land grant. All right. Then there were federal lands that were sold on credit from 1796 to 1820. The Bureau of Land Management is still putting those records into its system. Then there were the military bounty land grants. We'll talk more about them in a moment. They are a gold mine of family information. And then there are the homestead land grants. We'll talk about them in a moment. Also, the federal government, to encourage building railroads, gave huge amounts of federal land to the railroads. I think somebody said that if the railroads cashed in all the federal land that they were entitled to, this would come to be 2.5 times the size of the state of Texas. Also, after the Civil War, institutions of higher learning received federal lands as a gift from the federal government to help pay for colleges and universities. This, by the way, is where the great rivalry between the University of Alabama and Auburn University began. Because the Yankees had burned down the University of Alabama did not want federal lands. So Auburn University took the federal lands instead. And like I said, that was the first conflict between the two. Auburn is Alabama's federal land state, not the University of Alabama. All right, now let's talk about homestead land grants. Starting in 1862, federal lands were given to non-Confederate families of United States citizens. Now, there's three important points in this statement. First, the federal lands are being given away for free. You don't have to make installments. There's no credit involved. You get the land for free. Secondly, the federal land was not given to Confederate families. And the third thing is citizens. Your ancestor arrived in America from Hungary or Poland or France or wherever your ancestor comes from. Your ancestor cannot homestead, that is, get free federal land until your ancestor becomes a United States citizen, which back in those days only required 5 years residency and then going to a court of record and becoming a naturalized citizen. Okay, now, when you had lived on the land that you wanted for a certain time, you paid a small administrative fee to cover the paperwork, and then you received the grant or patent for the land. So basically, it is free land if you settle on the land and you develop the land. Now, for every year that a man served in the federal military during the Civil War, that reduced his residency requirement towards getting a homestead land. Now, if you're homesteading land, let's say it takes you, the law requires you to have to live on the land for 8 years before you can get the grant. But I served 3 years in the federal army during the Civil War. I only have to live on the homestead land for 5 years to get the grant because of my 3 years in the federal military service. Okay, now when we think of homesteads, we think of the West. We think of Nebraska and Kansas. We think of California, Nevada, places like that. However, there's also a lot of homesteading that went on in the South and North Alabama, including Coleman County, where I'm speaking to you from, was opened up by homesteading. After 1875, Confederate families were allowed to homestead too. And so you have in Coleman County was settled by Germans, citizens from Ohio, who came to Coleman in 1876, and they homesteaded land here. Starting in 1876, Coleman also had Georgians who came here because Confederate families were then allowed to homestead land. So in Coleman County was created by homesteading by German families, homesteading by Georgia families. Former slaves found themselves being cheated in their in trying to homestead land in the South. So many of them will move to Oklahoma and the West and they will be called exodusters. And if you're black and you live in Kansas or Oklahoma, it's you. It's a very proud statement to say that your ancestors were exodusters. Women, as heads of families, could homestead land. So you've got a poor widow and 4 children or something. She can homestead land, and the land is just as much hers as if she was a man. The content of homestead land applications varies widely and is usually not informative, but it can include, in some instances, proof of federal military service in the Civil War, naturalization records to prove your citizenship, record of settlement on the land, that is, depositions by your neighbors who describe what you've been doing on the land for the last 8 years, the improvements you've made on it. It can even include the list of family members. I've lived here, we've been living here 8 years. Here's all the things I did to the land. We came here with 4 kids. Now we've got 6, and here are their names and ages, etc. But you can find any sort of miscellaneous information in a homestead land application. The National Archives and Records Administration, College Park, Maryland, also has a special card catalog to land grants to 1908 for Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, Florida, Louisiana, Nevada, and Utah. And this includes applications for homestead grants that were never completed. Even if your ancestor did not receive a homestead land grant, you might want to contact the National Archives just to see if they applied for a homestead land, even if they never completed the process for whatever reason. And of course, information in a rejected or unfinished claim is just as good as information from anywhere else. All right, military bounty land grants. All right, the Continental Congress had promised its Continental soldiers land, and the Continental Congress failed to provide it. But as I say, you can learn about those lands in the American State Papers, including the soldiers who were entitled to that land. The United States gave land grants to veterans of the War of 1812, but only in the states of Arkansas, Illinois, and Missouri, and those have all been published. And this was kind of cheesy on the part of the United States. The only reason they gave the veterans the land there was to encourage veterans to live next to the Indian lands. So if there's another Indian war, you've got well-trained militia to deal with the Indians. Now, this is the important part here. From 1842 to 1858, the United States government offered free land in the federal land states to American veterans, including Indians who served with the U.S. military. Now, the veterans are going to get free land from 1842 to 1858 in federal land states, but not just the veterans. Widows of veterans could get land too. And if the widow and the veteran had not survived, the next of kin of the American veteran could get land. And so the veteran died, the widow of the veteran died, and his 14 children, their 14 children are going to show up and claim the land. All right, 550,000 claims were filed, although some were rejected, and there's a book available on this. All right, now let's talk about an individual claim. If a veteran applied for federal land in the federal land states, in his claim, he will tell you where he served in the military, he will tell you where he lived, and he will tell you where he is living at the time he's filing his claim. If he died at any time before he could file the claim, his widow could file a claim. Now, if she files a claim, she has to explain his military service. She also has to tell you where and when he died, and she has to give you her maiden name and when and where she married him. These federal land, these military bounty land claims for these 550,000 claims. For thousands and thousands of men, this is the only documentation on exactly when they died. For thousands and thousands of marriages, this is the only documentation that has survived of the marriage and the only proof of what the widow's maiden name was. Now, if the veteran has died before he could claim the land, if his widow has died before she could claim the land, whoever is the next of kin can claim the land. And most of the time, the next of kin who is claiming the land are the children of the veteran. They will give you all the same, they will give you the name of the veteran, they will give you his military service, they will give you when and where he died, and then they will give you the names of all of the veteran's heirs. And I have seen a list of 14 children, and every one of the females who was married, it was the man she was married to, who actually claims her share of the land. So that documents even more marriages that often do not have any documentation anywhere else. Okay. Now, copies of military bounty land claims, like copies of homestead land claims, should be sought from the National Archives and Records Administration. And if you go to this website, you go to this site, the National Archives and Records Administration, they will explain what you have to do to ask to get a copy of any attempt to get a military bounty claim or a homestead land claim. Okay, now this last part I'm sure just sounds absolutely wonderful to you. The chance of answering some difficult questions you thought you were never going to find the answer to, and maybe some more as a bonus to boot. However, there are real problems with using federal land records. First off, there is no complete single index to all federal land grants and patents, much less to all the records. All the indexes out there, including that of the Bureau of Land Management, are faulty to a degree. And so sometimes, like you say, you have to scratch your head a bit and you have to try several different ways to find out if your ancestor received federal land and if where that land was. Some people acquired federal land did not to settle on the land, but so that they could then turn around and sell the land to a land speculator like General Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson owned vast amounts of land in Alabama and Mississippi. It was his land speculations. And he would get other people to actually take out the grants, and then he would buy the land from them. This way he could hide from the public that he was that he was buying up so much land that the general public might have otherwise had. Some people lived on federal lands without having it granted to them. This was called squatting. It was also called tomahawk rights. Now, why would somebody settle on federal land and not take out a patent or a grant? Maybe they could not afford to. Also, since if you're squatting on federal land, you're not having to pay taxes on the land, not to anybody, because the land technically does not belong to you. Therefore, you don't have to pay property taxes. And a piece of land could not be homesteaded if someone lived on it. Let's say I come to your part of the West and I find myself a really nice piece of property that's not been granted, but you're living on it. I cannot homestead that land until you agree to give it up. Now, there's a famous misrepresentation of all of this. You may remember a really charming TV show called Little House on the Prairie. And you may remember the last episode where the citizens of Hero Township blew up their town and burned down their homes because their land was about to be taken from them by evil land speculators. Okay, there was a lot wrong with that episode. First off, the real Ingalls family was nothing like how they're portrayed on Little House on the Prairie. They were dirt poor. They were squatters. They knowingly, illegally sat on that land in Hero Township. So did their neighbors to get out of paying taxes. Furthermore, when these evil land speculators who actually own the land show up, um, they could not have made the Ingalls or anybody else leave. Well, yes, they could. If the Ingalls had squatted on the land before it was granted, then the Ingalls could have sat there till Gabriel blows his horn, and nobody would have made them move. Now, let me also point out to this, the Ingalls also got involved in settling on Indian land illegally for the same reason they squatted on federal land, which is truly amazing because they hated Indians. But the story has a happy ending. Eventually, Pa Ingalls does homestead land. He does homestead land and settles on it and legally settles on the land. And on top of that, he ends up getting a federal government job. So, like I said, the story has a happy ending to it. All right. And as they say, somebody could make payments on a piece of land for years and then lose the land because they did not make the last payment on it. Now, one good example of this was Madge Barefield's books. Miss Barefield published a book on each of Alabama's land offices, except one. And you go to this book, and here's a list of all the people who received land grants in Alabama by land office. That's all well and good. But in instances where payments were made by other people other than the person who made the final payment, she leaves those names out. She left those names out. So if your ancestor was making payments on a land grant in Alabama, but did not actually make the final payment and did not get the land grant, they're not going to show up with that grant in Miss Barefield's book. Now, in defense of Madge, who was a good friend of mine, she's right 90-something% of the time. The person who's been making the payments all along is also the person who made the last payment and will get the land grant. This is a very small problem, in other words. Excuse me. But you needed to be made aware of it. But as they say, almost all the time, the person who made the last payment was also the same person who was making all the payments all along. All right, and finally, and this is a bunch of, well, I guess little things that just need to be here as a form of housekeeping, if you would. The federal land states of Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi took over their own land granting during the Civil War. Reason is these were Confederate states. When they left the Union, until they were returned to the Union, they handled their own land granting. And whatever records they have of that is at their respective state archives or in the National Archives at Atlanta. The records are not much and they're not terribly enlightening, but as I say, little bits of housekeeping here. Many of the tract books for individual counties and federal land states have been published. And they usually have really cute names like Coleman County Homesteading or something, or Homesteads or something like that. We have an example one here, Family Maps of Hancock County, Ohio. This is actually just a publication of the county tract book. Now, let me say in defense of these books, though, they are wonderful, and I turn to them all the time myself. And the reason is the people who compile these books, they also include modern county maps, so that as you go through it and you find your ancestor in such a book, you can then go to the next page and actually see where the land is that they received the grant or patent on. Now, Georgia, 3/5 of Georgia was granted under a system by the state of Georgia called the land lottery system or the land lotteries. And on a map, Georgia's land lotteries look like the federal land system. They are not. They have nothing in common other than both uses grids. Both use grids. Other than that, Georgia's land granting system and the federal land granting system have nothing in common. Okay, now I'm going to try to find the controls here for the chat. So I had it before. Um, okay, this is the end of the slideshow.
Oh, hold on, Robert. I just wanted to say, I can use the chat myself if you want to leave your screen up, share your
Yes,
screen
I'd really
yourself.
like to do that. Let's do that, please.
Yeah, that way you can refer back to a slide. So I'm going to ask the class to go ahead and either unmute your microphone, leave your camera off, but unmute your microphone if you have a question directly for him, or if you prefer, if you're more comfortable, you can put it in the chat box. And while I'm waiting for that to happen, I have a few questions that I jotted down during your presentation. Now, you mentioned land grants were granted by foreign governments. Where would those records be? Would they be here in the US, or would they be in foreign country archives?
That's an excellent question. You're asking if the land was granted by a foreign nation, where do you go for the records of that? First place you go to is the American state papers, because if you have land that was granted by a foreign nation, you had to register it with the United States to keep your title to it. Now, unfortunately, from there, things get very crazy. For example, California. Uh, the at the California State Archives in Sacramento, they have a lot of Spanish and Mexican land grant records, but there are others in Spain. Situations are similar to that here in Alabama. We have some Spanish and French records of land grants at the Alabama Archives. We have more at the Alabama Public Library, at the Mobile Public Library, that were copied from the archives of France and Spain. Florida, some of Florida's Spanish land granting records are at the Florida State Archives in Gainesville. Some of the others are at the University I beg your pardon, the State Archives in Tallahassee. Some of them are at the University of Florida in Gainesville, and some of them are in Cuba, believe it or not. Like I said, the whole thing is crazy, but it all depends, unfortunately, on the state. And the best advice on that is to go to the state archives. Now, for Louisiana, there was a very good book that was done on Louisiana territorial records, French Louisiana territorial records, by Henry Pudney Beers, Beers, Henry Pudney Beers, on Louisiana French records. It's just absolutely super. But again, you need to go to the respective state, ask at the state archives, and they'll fill you in on what you've got to do to check those records. But as they say, always start with the American state papers.
Great advice. Thank you. Now, one of the students named Betty, she says in the chat box, my family settled in Wisconsin in 1848. I suspect they bought the land from someone, but perhaps they got a grant. Where would I go to find this information?
All right, what you need to do first is go to the website of the National Archives and Records Administration. Then go to federal lands there, and I've got the site here on the let's see here. Got the site here. I cite it on the slide here. Okay, first thing I would do is I would go to the National Archives and Records Administration for that. And I'm getting there. Yeah, here we go. Go to the National Archives website, and they will explain the federal land records to you. And they will explain to you how you ask them to search for federal land records for your ancestor. Now, you also need to go to the Bureau of Land Management's website and search there for the patent, for the patent. And again, go here to the Bureau of Land Management website. Yeah, right here. Go there to the Bureau of Land Management. And they're using their index is brutally simple. You just simply type in the name, and you would need to put in Wisconsin. You press enter, and then it all comes up on the screen for you. And if your ancestor actually got a land grant in Wisconsin, you can push a button and you can actually get an exact copy of it signed by the President of the United States at that time, etc. Now, that none of this will help you if they bought the land from somebody else, like from the railroads or from the University of Wisconsin or something. This is not going. This system will not help you. One other source you need to check with, and that is to contact the Wisconsin State Archives, which actually I think is the Wisconsin Historical Society in Madison. But you need to contact the archives and ask them the same thing you basically asked me. My ancestors settled in Wisconsin in 1848. I do not know if they received a federal land grant or if they bought the land from someone else. What do you have that can help me? What do you have that you can help me? So those three sources, the National Archives, put in a request for a search for the records, the Bureau of Land Management, type in a name and see what comes up, and third, contact the the State Historical Society of Wisconsin in Madison.
Great advice. Thank you. I want to kind of add something to what you just said about the Bureau of Land Management website. I actually put in my ancestor's name who lived in a county in Iowa. And not only did I find the copy of his original land grant, but I also found out who he sold the land to after he sold it.
Wow.
Yeah, it was right there in the record. So I can see how that actually might be very beneficial to the students because, even if the last name that they sold it to is not the same, that could be a son-in-law.
Oh, absolutely.
Or a brother-in-law.
The federal land records bear a striking resemblance to military records. And in the resemblance is the fact that you're just looking for whatever you know what you're expecting. But in any record that you look into, there could be something that you didn't expect that's not routinely there, but there it is, and as I say, information is just as good if it's unexpected as if you planned for it.
Also, just one more question regarding the Bureau of Land Management, since we're talking about it. You mentioned that they're in the process of scanning. Do you know whether there is a estimation as to when particular record sets will be done?
No, ma'am, I don't. And I'm a little embarrassed about that because I've not kept up with that. And they may be further along in these. I know they got the basic patents done first, and they've had those done for years. And then they went back to try to get this other stuff because the others are much more complicated. But they may well be much further along on this than much more further along on this than I'm giving them credit for. I know at the National Archives, they're doing a monster index to the federal military bounty land records. I think by now they're up to like the letter M or something. But if you go to the National Archives and who you're looking for is higher up the alphabet than what the National Archives has done so far, the first thing they ask you to do is go to the Bureau of Land Management's index and see if you can find the patent there. If you can find the patent and the patent says military, then they'll have the numbers and everything will be just fine. But anyway, the good thing about this is ultimately we're going to have two different indexes to the military bounty land records, Bureau of Land Management's patent index, and then the National Archives index as well.
Do you mind going back to that slide that showed that book on the family maps?
Sure, not a problem. That's at the end. It took me a little bit of an effort to find.
Right there, yeah. Okay, and I wanted to let the class know that our library has two. Unfortunately, that's a small number because that series of books is quite extensive. But we have two in that series. We have family maps of Howell County, Missouri, and we have family maps of Texas County, Missouri. And that was actually one of these two books is the one I was doing my volunteer to do lookups in this week. And also I want to let the class know, if you find a book that would contain the family maps of the county of where your ancestors lived, we do have an online form on our website, on the TMCC Library website, where you can request a purchase of this book to be added into our genealogy book collection. So if you don't know that link, just shoot me an email and I'll be happy to send you the link, where you can just go right to the TMCC Library website and click on under students, and you don't have to be a student to go to this part of the website, but just click on students, and then there's some forms. There's a link that says forms, and one of those forms is request to purchase a book. So once again, I encourage you to become involved in our collection development and make a suggestion of genealogy books that you'd like to see in our genealogy book collection.
Now,
So-
a really good trick on doing that is to contact the public library of the county you're interested in and see if they will copy the pages for you, or if they will at least tell you what books like this they have. We have some counties in Alabama where the county tract book has been published 2 or 3 times. And of course, that's all great, because if they missed your ancestor in one of them, maybe they didn't in one of the others. And also the Mid-Continent Public Library in Independence, Missouri. They have a huge genealogy collection, and they loan the books out on interlibrary loan, which almost no other genealogical library will do. So if you find out from the local public library that your ancestors' county has something like this family maps of Hancock County, then check with the Mid-Continent Public Library and see if they have a copy of that book that they will loan out to you on interlibrary loan to your local public library.
Oh, great advice. Yeah, absolutely. Now, I wanted to, I wanted to give the class one last chance to put questions in the chat box. I have gotten a couple people saying thank you, that they have taken other classes on land grants, but they thought that you explained the Meridian and the baseline really, really well. So a lot of people are saying thank you for that. Robert, I wanted to let you know. And then also, I wanted to welcome to the class today. We had 2 new people that introduced themselves in the chat box, Betty and Regina. So I wanted to say thank you to Betty and Regina for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And we hope you join us every week if you can. And then also, Robert, I wanted to thank you for allowing us to videotape the presentation today. And it'll usually take about a week or 2, but our marketing department will get that up and posted on our YouTube channel. And then I wanted to also let all the class know that if there's anything in the chat box that you wanted to capture from today, like for instance, all those free webinars that are coming up, all you got to do is click on those 3 little dots there in the bottom right-hand side of the chat box. And you can download the entire chat box and get all those wonderful discussions as well as links that were in the chat box. So with that, Robert, I don't see any more questions in the chat box. Let's just give the class just a few more seconds to see. Is there anybody who'd like to unmute their microphone and ask Robert a question directly?
So this is Wendy.
Hi, Wendy.
Hi, good morning, and thank you, thank you, Bob. I appreciate it. It's really great information. I have family that I know that has land in Kansas, own some of it. But what I've been really interesting, and like the lady that asked about in Wisconsin, is I have my my German side of the family that I didn't realize had gotten any land grants. And so now that when I'm researching them, even though I don't think they ever had any land or they were really poor or whatever, I just put their name into the BLM in that state and see if any of the names look familiar. That's, just a real quick way to start the process. So that BLM research is really easy. I know that. So I just wanted to share that with with the group. So, and if you,
That's a very good idea.
yeah. And if anybody has questions on reading maps too, I've been taught how to read, do the reading just like Bob was telling us. So my grandpa would walk through and say, okay, now I want you to describe this property for me. And I'd have to do it in northwest quarter of the blah, 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 blah. So I can help if somebody's really stuck on that piece. So, and then I can't find it. The one last thing is about the military bounty information. I just had found something about that, about one of my ancestors, and I can't remember which one it is. And I was going to try to track it down, but it almost looked like what you were explaining, that it actually was given to one soldier, but then another soldier got it and his wife ended up taking it because she was the widow of that one soldier. So I don't know how all that happened, if soldiers could sell their interest before they even got their land grant, but I just thought it was really odd. And again, I can't put my fingers on it, so I can't go, fact A, fact B, fact C. But
What you're saying, it makes perfectly good sense. A lot of times, in fact, during the American Revolution, a lot of the Revolutionary War soldiers sold their claims to land because the Continental Congress wasn't going to give them the land after all, and maybe they could make a few bucks from it that they needed right now. And of course, some of these people later used these certificates to acquire large tracts of land. But I'm sure there was nothing hinky going on there. The soldier didn't want the land, but he needed some money. So the soldier or the widow of the soldier sold the land. But something
right,
you've got to keep in mind in all of this is that whenever land is involved, there's going to be fraud. There's going to be monkey business. There's going to be a lot of weird stuff going on. And that still goes on today. We can land a man on the moon, but we can't come up with a land grant system that isn't ripe with fraud and loopholes and strange stuff going on. So I was
right.
I may not have made that as clear as I wanted to in this presentation, but you can run into some really strange things going on. And unless somebody sues somebody, you may never find out exactly what's happening.
Right. Well, that gives up a good point that we should be looking, everything we need to always verify. But it was just interesting how you brought that up, because I was very interested in today's presentation. So thank you.
Okay, anybody else? Just go ahead and please feel free to unmute your microphone and ask the question directly to Robert. Robert has an incredible amount of expertise, so this is your chance to get free advice on how to break through that brick wall.
I guess
Okay.
the other thing,
go ahead.
This is Wendy again. So if you're trying to find something on the, those East Coast, or on the east side of East Coast, and a lot of the records were burnt during the Civil War, but I guess this would have been after. So a lot of those land grants were after the Civil War, right? There was a little bit before, but not much.
Okay, when you're talking about federal land records, there were no records lost because these are federal government records. They're not kept at the courthouse. They're not kept at the state capitol.
Okay.
So these being federal records, almost always are safe. Now, if you're talking about one of the states that was not a federal land state, each state's record history is different. Records were destroyed, records were stolen, records were lost by whatever means. Sometimes the records weren't kept. But that's an important thing to understand when you're whatever you're researching in old records. Always keep in mind where the record was kept. I mean, for example, birth and death certificates. You say, well, the courthouse burned down in 1948, taking them all with it. No, because the copies were sent to the state capitol, so they were not lost. Anyway, I'm not saying that there's a copy of everything somewhere, although I've got a friend who swears by that. That I don't believe that for a moment. But what I'm trying to say is understand always that understand where the record should have been kept. And if you understand where the record should have been kept, maybe the record was not lost.
Great advice. Okay, anybody else? Go ahead and please feel free to unmute your microphone. We got some people clapping. I see the little icons. Okay. All right. Well, Robert, I assume that's the end of the questions then. And I'll once again say thank you for your wonderful expertise. And you've been very generous with my class, being a repeat speaker. And I will go ahead and before I stop the recording, I'll invite the class to stay on for the next hour. We'll be working on everyone's family trees, either in groups or individually. It's up to you. And this is the second part of the lab for the two people, Regina and Betty, who joined us for the first time today. I hope you can stay after and show us your family tree and let us help you with your family tree. So with that, Robert, I will go ahead and stop the recording and say thank you for once again a wonderful and very informative presentation.
You're very welcome, ma'am.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.